Hello, everyone. Welcome. I want to thank you for joining today's webcast. My name is Dina Evans, and I am excited to be with you today. I'm the Marketing and Special Events Manager here at Looking Glass Cyber Solutions. And today's presentation is, are your third parties a ticking time bomb? I'm really excited to have with us today our presenter. We've got Ryan Curran, who is our Senior Sales Engineer here with Looking Glass. Just a couple quick things before we begin. I want to run through a very few quick housekeeping notes for the On24 platform. Each of you, please notice there's a chat window on the left side of your screen where you should feel free to submit any questions that you may have throughout the presentation for our speaker through that window. All of our audience members are muted, so if you have any questions at all, you'll need to submit your questions there through the chat screen. At the end of the session, we'll try to address all the questions, but if we happen to run out of time, then we'll be sure to contact you directly following the presentation and make sure that all questions get answered. Please note that any questions submitted through this chat feature are only viewed by the presenters and not by fellow audience members. So if you prefer to have your question addressed privately, please make sure that you indicate that in your comments, and we'll contact you directly if desired. Also note there's a resource list on the right side of your screen. We have an array of links to third-party risk content, so you can feel free to look through those and download them at your convenience. But right now, without any further delay, let me go ahead and pass this over to Ryan and to get us kicked off with today's webcast. Ryan?
Thanks, Dina. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the webinar. Today, we'll be discussing interconnected cyber ecosystems, their impact on you, and how to make your organization more resilient to the dangers they present. So, are they ticking time bombs? Can you even tell if they're ticking time bombs? Outsourcing and strategic partnerships have become more prevalent in today's market to enable business, reduce cost, and stay ahead of competition. However, the movement of confidential data outside of its own defense perimeter has also opened organizations up to a myriad of cybersecurity risks. So we'll discuss some of those risks, how to address those challenges, and how to build a program to provide you those continuous coverage capabilities to give you the visibility and situational awareness you need to protect yourself. We've broken up today's discussion into 4 sections: the problems inherent in third-party interaction, the current state of the industry, potential solutions, and then how to action it, right? That's always really important. How do I take this information, this data, this data points I get, and how do I make them actionable? So first, we'll talk about the problem set associated with third-party interaction. As a function of an ever-increasingly connected ecosystem, your organization takes on inherent risks by granting access to your networks, assets, or data to the third parties you rely on. However, many of your third parties do not have the budget or scale to protect themselves like you do. This reality has created a dynamic in which threat actors and criminals target and leverage your third parties to get to you and your data. While these third-party connections are a necessary evil of expanding business and maintaining operational continuity, assessing and monitoring those third parties becomes an important tool in your security toolbox to limit your personal and organizational exposure. As you see here, these statistics back up this well-known conundrum: the need to rely on third-party assets while simultaneously minimizing your risk. Your cyber assets are constantly under assault by a host of actors with nefarious purposes, both threat actor groups as well as basic cyber criminals. At the same time, your teams are also resource constrained. So extending them into the realm of oversight of your third parties compounds this problem by adding extra tasking to their workload. Without the proper capabilities, processes, and policies in place to manage these external connections, you are putting yourself at greater risk by inadvertent exposure. The damage from a breach is potentially catastrophic to your brand reputation, public confidence in you, and potentially your stock value. Another forcing factor is the increase in industry regulations mandating minimum cybersecurity practices and oversight. In recent years, there has been a a large push on the regulatory front to ensure organizations are implementing safe data protection practices to protect the data of their consumers as well as the privacy of the citizens who are their consumers. The EU is implementing probably the most important change in data privacy regulation in 20 years, the General Data Protection Regulations, which applies to all companies processing and holding personal data of anyone residing in the EU, regardless of the company's location. That's really key. As we get into multinational corporations and businesses that do, and organizations that do business overseas, you have now even greater regulatory responsibilities to sufficiently protect data and privacy of your consumers or your customers, even if they are overseas in this case. An increased number of cyber incidents and more regulations have steadily marked a subsequent increase in the number and amount of paid out of penalties levied against organizations as they try to catch up. You see in the background here steadily increasing penalties levied against organizations over the last 10 years. Sensitivity to third-party breaches are heightened as more high-profile organizations are targeted, hacked, and exposed. All of these organizations here have faced difficulties because of their third-party relationships and the access they were granted. Even large corporations, like you see here, with large security budgets can fall prey to weak links. And there are real repercussions that can affect you. You see here the quote from the Financial Times in which share prices dropped after penalties were levied because of lacking cybersecurity policies. There's several real-life outcomes here, right? There's the embarrassment of having your organization's name being splashed across the media, damage to your brand and reputation, potential loss of market share, and of course the fines or financial burden that you have to pay out to the government based on your relationship with those third parties. All of these intersecting factors necessitate you having more awareness of your third parties and the risks they may be injecting into your cyber ecosystem. If you don't have visibility into how they may impact you, if you don't have visibility into how they may impact them, you definitely don't have visibility into how they may impact you. Because these third parties are outside of your control, it necessitates you having greater vigilance and monitoring them. Your ability to have greater visibility and therefore understanding of their risks enables you to have more informed policy for security operations. Okay, so let's move on to a quick look at the current state of the industry and their security posture and in addressing cybersecurity risks pertaining to third parties. The old paradigm of cybersecurity that predominated up until a few years ago is what I term castle and moat. What this means is an organization focused on building up their own defenses as high and as deep as possible. This posture didn't factor in third parties very heavily. In fact, if anything was implemented toward third parties, it was more of a check-the-box approach, which constituted yearly surveys and or occasional site visits. But this approach had several faults. It was internally focused and didn't take into consideration extensive third-party networks and their access to your data. While you may be secure up on your parapet, that vantage point didn't provide you the necessary visibility to assess operations outside of your walls. In many ways, without a more comprehensive approach, you are blind to the risks being introduced into your environment by those third parties. As stated, many organizations relied or rely on a check-the-box approach, but checklists do not guarantee appropriate security measures are in place. In some ways, it could be argued, these actually incentivize third parties to not report or underreport potential issues in their own environment so they don't legally combat you. Checklists don't even verify that the third party can adequately assess their own security posture. Each new third party in your ecosystem increases your overall attack surface and therefore it is essential you have a program in place to properly address that risk. Proper measures should be in place to pre-screen third parties, assess their risk posture, onboard them to your ecosystem, and continuously monitor them for threats. The check-the-box approach addresses none of those needs. But who exactly is attacking your supply chain, your third parties? There's a plethora of actors and criminals out there, both sophisticated and not, who can exploit a variety of vulnerabilities in your environment to gain access to your data, and once in, can move laterally. In many cases, your third parties are softer targets than you are, and threat actors know this. So what they'll do is they'll go after your third parties as a target because they have a weaker barrier. While you can't necessarily dictate your third-party security operations, you can be aware of where they're vulnerable and be alerted to when they've been exploited or exposed. And it's not just hacks you need to be aware of or wary of. There's a variety of other risk factors that are introduced into your environment through the use of third-party software and applications. These also need to be managed and patched and remediated to ensure your security. So while today we're primarily talking about third parties, those organizations or companies that you interact with that have access to your data, there's also the issue of internally used applications, software, et cetera, that also needs to be addressed and considered when dealing with your overall third-party posturing. Again, the evolution of business necessitates these additional interactions, and therefore you also need procedural actions to minimize the risk factors from a variety of attack surface vectors. Okay, so we have our first of two poll questions for today's webinar. Do you see third-party risk as an issue you need to focus on now or in the immediate future? I'm going to assume that most of you do since you're here on this webinar, but if you can go ahead and answer those, we'll give everybody a few seconds to respond. And the reason we're asking is because more and more frequently our existing and potential customers are asking us how our technology platforms or services could assist their efforts or work with them to build their programs, to give them that wider lens into cyber risk. So what Looking Glass has done specifically is taken different aspects of our product portfolio and service portfolios and mashed them together to provide integrated service line or solution line to give direct finished intelligence to consumers such as yourself. And Dina will be looking at those results as we move along. Okay, so the solution then to the problems in the current state of the industry we've addressed above is to acknowledge that your ecosystem, and expanded ecosystem including your third-party suppliers and providers, introduces risk to your environment, and of course we need to address those challenges. Solutioning can be complex, but through the use of a distinct set of capabilities, you can quickly ramp up a third-party oversight program that will dramatically reduce your overall risk posture. In this new paradigm, your third-party monitoring program should be constructed around the concept of continuous monitoring. To accomplish this, you will need capabilities that enable you to have visibility into the network infrastructure and web presence of your third parties. This will allow you to essentially assess what your attack surface is in the first place. Employing open source and commercially available intelligence feeds is a good start. So this will act as a basis for understanding what publicly available information is being reported about your third parties or is available on the internet. Expanding past that, the incorporation of internet intelligence information is preferable. This will actually provide you more data about the risks and vulnerabilities in those infrastructures and those web presences that you care about. Again, your third parties. This would include issues such as vulnerable unpatched systems, anomalous domains in their IP space, and potentially phishing campaigns or DDoS attacks being planned by bad guys before they've actually occurred, planned by bad guys against those third parties. Why are these types of data sets important? Because these additions give you a more holistic insight into your third party's risk level. So the benefit of this approach is that it is not dependent on information your third party chooses to provide to you, or conversely, choose not to provide to you. Since you are the driver of this monitoring, you are more autonomous in your process and can create a cleaner environment for analysis and mitigation policy creation. Once you've spun up these capabilities to perform passive continuous monitoring, the use cases and reporting derived from that are very useful. So in this case, reporting will include third-party benchmarking and risk scoring, due diligence during the new third-party selection process before you even have them on contract, and better insight to inform your policy management. On this last point, having a variety of metrics at your fingertips about threats, vulnerabilities, and ultimately the role of risk will allow you to create third-party specific mitigation policies. Your utilization of the aforementioned data sets and metrics will provide you with concrete data to inform your decision-making processes regarding your third-party remediation efforts. The check-the-box approach doesn't provide you enough visibility, and a static scorecard approach doesn't provide you direction. A generalized score is good for awareness, but provides little concrete data or insight to give you action. You need awareness and alerting on real-time vulnerabilities and threats, as well as potential issues in your third-party assets to give you that action at the end. This gives you a better sense of the overall risk in relation to your assumed risk by relying on those third parties. Together, these will give you more definition on how to mitigate those risks to your specific environment and, of course, your data. Ultimately, more access points means more potential points of failure. The first step in assessing risk in your third-party ecosystem is the exploration and identification of attack surface. To do so requires performing passive monitoring to discover and define where you're connected to your third parties, where you're potentially vulnerable, and what data lies at those endpoints. Or conversely, from the outside in, what systems or services are those third parties running for you that may impact your business? Also consider the fact that a threat actor has tools to enumerate your attack surface to determine the access points, and once inside, will attempt lateral movements to other networks or data. Your third parties are a bridge to do just that for those threat actors. At a minimum, you should have the capability to replicate what a threat actor can see about you, about your attack surface using open source tools and data. Another quote from the same Wired article tells us, attack surface awareness is no security panacea, but understanding how a network's exposure relates to its risk of being breached gives a lot of valuable context. In the process of onboarding new third parties, consider asking them to perform an assessment of their own attack surface, including their own third-party ecosystem. Judging their findings may provide you valuable insight into their internal security maturity if they've considered issues such as this and how they can address those issues. And if you're already doing passive monitoring, of course, you can verify their findings. Further, in building a third-party assessment program, redefine, quote-unquote, threat intelligence and embrace the possibilities. Threat intelligence is no longer a handful of data feeds about malware or phishing emails. Those are still around, of course, but that is not a core component anymore of your assessment program, whether it's related to third parties or your own internal security mechanisms. Threat intelligence needs to be more holistic in nature to include aspects about the internet itself, unstructured and structured threat intel collection, brand awareness, targeted attacks, and industry-specific trends. Threat intelligence is no longer solely infected hosts. To assess your attack surface, including your third-party ecosystem, you need a variety of data sets about potential threats and vulnerabilities that could impact your third parties and, of course, therefore you. And these capabilities, The collection methodologies, the data sets, and the analysis need to occur in near real time and also be automated. This will overall better support integrated teams within your organization and their own decision-making hierarchies. The combination of these two intelligence streams, both internet and threat intelligence, provides value because it gives you broader situational awareness of the risk factors in your third parties, and then also actionable data to mitigate those risks. Without having the ability to passively monitor those third parties in real time and be alerted to issues, you have very little leverage or decision-making ability. Automated data collection and aggregation capabilities are essential to give you this level of insight into your ecosystem. And you have the data to back it up to inform explicit and effective mitigation strategies. It's not just a score to go off of. By combining internet intelligence and threat intelligence, you can tackle continuous monitoring of your third parties as well as expand your horizon to look at larger initiatives. For example, what you see here is automated statistical reporting about specific classifications of threats over time in different industry verticals. This output is only producible through an aggregation of multiple threat intelligence and internet intelligence awareness. The capability to passively monitor different types of network infrastructures, as well as correlate massive amounts of a variety of threat intelligence, allows for this type of representation of industry vertical threat trending. This is useful. This is useful to identify which individual APTs or botnets or ransomware or individual threat actors are targeting your industry this week or this month. In the grand scheme, that information can be utilized on your own network teams or your own network infrastructure to protect yourself. And because, again, you have the data behind the visual representation, you can extract the TCPs and the IOCs you need to drive into your network layer to do that type of protection. These details will prevent you from becoming the next victim of future attacks or even 0 days. This is just one example of the numerous ways you could use an expanded idea of threat intelligence in your environment or your third-party ecosystem. Specifically, represented here are several types of issues you need to have awareness of in your third-party ecosystem to properly assess their security posture. Asset vulnerabilities, data leaks, compromised user credentials, bad guy pre-planning activities, and active infections in their IP network infrastructures. So these, again, are just a few examples of high-value data sets that you may want to consider integrating into your third-party monitoring program. So now, let's move to talking about how all these concepts can be turned into action to give you greater situational awareness and protection. Because ultimately, that's where we're all trying to drive this. The first action is the footprint. Footprinting is the gathering of information about a specific organization regarding the various aspects of their presence. This includes their network infrastructure, the systems or apps running in that environment, their web presence, and or the various aspects of their attack surface. So this is important because this is what a threat actor will attempt to do against you and obviously your third parties. So this reconnaissance and identification will give you visibility into various aspects of your ecosystem and risks possibly associated with those. It's also important to consider appropriately scoping your efforts, right? We can't just go have unlimited resources and money and people to go through problems like this. So you need to appropriately scope your efforts. So questions like, how important is the third party to my day-to-day operations? How much access to my networks? How much access to my networks do they have? What type of data do they have access to? Are they themselves targeted a lot? Answering these types of questions internally will lessen the burden on your individual resources and help you understand and prioritize which footprinting techniques to deploy for each of your third parties. And this will also, as a byproduct, thereby decrease alert fatigue. The combination of open source unstructured collection and network-centric structured collection will be the basis of all your other subsequent activities. So this is a really important function you have to perform. It will define your attack surface so you know what to continuously monitor and be alerted on. Footprinting and running a continuous monitoring program will enable baselining, continuous alerting, trending, and educated mitigation strategies to lower your individual organization's overall risk. As discussed, you could footprint an entire industry vertical as a single analytical unit to assess what types of vulnerabilities and threats are impacting spaces related to you so that you could deploy industry-specific mitigation strategies. And again, you have the data behind this so that you can represent data sets to multiple levels of consumers within your organization, whether it's a high-level C-suite finished product report to the individual IOCs necessary to share with your security and network operations teams for network deployment and mitigation. So this is showing the capacity for Looking Glass's technology platforms to monitor massive amounts of IP space as single units and to instantly correlate threat intelligence to those spaces. Again, for the sake of demonstration, we have footprint industry verticals, but this is entirely flexible and fully customizable. So it could be your entire infrastructure, a subnet of your network, networks of your third parties, a single IP that's a mail server, etc. Having the capability to craft and monitor networks of interest to you is what's key here. The next step in operationalizing this program is to have automated systems to perform the collection, aggregation, management, and analysis of these various data sets so that you are provided an actionable output. Having a set of systems or platforms to prioritize this data on your behalf is essential to maximize you and your team's output and streamline your mitigation strategies, or having a service that performs that for you. In essence, a scoring and filtering mechanism to ensure you are receiving high confidence, high criticality incident alerting to focus on. Having large-scale awareness of your third-party ecosystem is great, but but you also need a capability to sort, analyze, prioritize, and action those data sets. So to summarize, you need to bring in data collection capabilities from a variety of threat vectors that are applicable to the entire spectrum of your third-party ecosystem. Utilize platforms your analysts can task and interact with to manage the data. Have ecosystem specific to you and industry-wide analysis to you performed by platforms embedded by your analysts. And automate the integration of these data sets and their outputs into your various security and network operations teams to perform the real-time alerting, threat response, and mitigation. You need to actually protect yourself. Building up this program requires both machine and human involvement to find the right mix of scale and accuracy while aggregating millions of intel pieces, correlating those pieces to provide context, and to provide your resources and prioritize your resources and mitigation strategies. The program ultimately gives you both rapid alerting and contextual alerting of risks within your expanded ecosystem so that you are provided the most value. Growing this as an internal alerting, response, and action initiative will also create additional efficiencies across those teams. Now take all those processes we just described and turn them into action that supports your various teams. Those teams within your organization could include HR, legal, physical security, corporate security, and also the other teams you see listed on this page, the vulnerability management team, the IT and ops teams, third-party risk teams, network operation and SecOps teams. All of those different teams within your organization can all utilize these same data sets in different ways for different purposes to support their individual missions within your overall organization. And again, as I just mentioned, as data correlation goes across those teams, they will likely see additional efficiencies spur out of that. The assessment program has data sets and features to enable prioritization and mitigation strategies in respect to your third parties and across your teams within your organization. All right, Well, before we move on to summary, we have one last poll question for the webinar. How mature do you consider your third-party risk program to be? And again, we'll give a couple seconds here for everybody to respond. And this time, we were specifically interested in asking this question, mostly related to the aspect of industry cyber intelligence needs as it grows. We found that organizations across the maturity spectrum all have this need, and they're sort of either already in that space or moving into that space or planning on moving into that space. So this is primarily sort of where you think you fit right now in relation to either your homegrown or your acquired capabilities. So we're just sort of checking to get a pulse on where you're at currently. Okay, now let's move on to summary. So to summarize, 3 aspects of this continuous monitoring program. Planning, the acquisition of platforms to do automated collection of threat intel. And again, threat intel is broad in this context. Operational, getting analysis on your ecosystem and those third parties and deriving analysis out of that. Context and correlation, the output that drives your decision making. And then, of course, after that is taking action on those aspects to reduce your individual risk at your organization. So how those aspects are accomplished are the continuous monitoring of your third party's attack surface through real-time collection across a number of intel domains. So this is essentially what I described as threat intelligence earlier. And that would include both open source as well as network-centric elements or data sets. And this would be done in a 24/7 by 365 automated process that does assessments and alerting of the risks which could potentially impact you. So how do you do this? So what individual tools do you need to augment and perform this type of third-party continuous monitoring program? 3 primary tool sets are necessary. 1 is the automated technology platforms to collect the all-source intelligence we've described here, including sources and content from the surface web, the deep web, dark net, and social media, as well as intel about the internet itself, and a number of threat intelligence feeds about threat actors and botnets and ransomware and spam and phishing, etc. The second tool set is the automated ingestion, management, correlation, analysis, and scoring technology platform to take in millions of individual data points from the all-source collection above and provide you the contextualization, relevancy, and alerting to support your individual workflows and your required outputs for your own team's missions. The third and final tool set is the automated generation of finished intelligence reports and products to support multiple functions or teams within your organization and the different technical expertise levels they may have. The next step out of these capabilities is the automated mitigation portion to perform action on your network side to ensure you are protected against the most high priority threats or risks impacting you via your third parties. So Looking Glass, for example, has deployed, developed and employs several technology platforms to task, collect, generate, and aggregate intelligence that supports and augments third-party oversight from a more holistic approach. And then we also have capabilities to remediate and mitigate on those risks. By utilizing the data and contextualization these platforms create, you can achieve a larger picture assessment of your third party's risk profile from a variety of aspects, which is ultimately where you're trying to go here, right? Having a score is good, but you need to have a broader context and broader source recognition, pulling data from those resources or those sources to give you a broader picture of what your attack surface actually looks like and where your third parties fall within that attack surface and where they're potentially introducing risk to that attack surface. So what questions do you have?
Hey, Ryan. Okay, there's a few that have come in from the audience, so let's just kind of start at the top. The first one is, why is having a variety of cyber reporting important in evaluating my third party?
Sure. So I mentioned there right at the end as well, but it is crucially important to take a more holistic approach to your collection of threat intelligence because it gives you more coverage on the surface web, the deep web, the dark net, and the network infrastructures that give you a differentiated, more total picture of the third party's true risk profile. So, for example, you don't want to know what actors are planning against you on the surface web. You want to know what they're planning against you on the deep web and the dark net too. I want to have coverage over all those spaces. That way I know what people are saying about me in any of those places. Or you don't want just malware feeds because that is part of the overall picture. And without the internet intel, it's hard to derive context and intent. So what I mean by that is if I have a feed about malware and it has a bunch of 1,000 IPs in it, if I don't know which of those IPs belong to my third party specifically, I derive less value because I have less context, and that gives me no action. So it's really the combination of all these things together in totality that gives you a broader picture and therefore more context and therefore more action to move on. You want to have a wide automated approach to the data generation, collection, and aggregation to give you that global intelligence perspective.
Awesome. Okay, here's another one. This one's pretty good, Ryan. This one says, how do I utilize this information and make it actionable?
Sure, right, because that's where we all want to go with it. How do I take these capabilities and these data sets and ultimately do something with them? So there are several ways you can make this info actionable. Typically what we see is you can integrate it into your internal tool sets. So a lot of people have SIEMs, or they have firewalls, or they have ticketing systems, or some variation thereof. So we see a lot of customers populate those systems with a lot of what we described here, and then utilize the subsequent correlation of that for additional use cases, whether it's website takedown, or I want to block an IP because I think it's bad, et cetera, whether it's coming from a third party or not. Or you can use the info to notify your third party and create workflows with them to follow up to show remediation efforts to guarantee that your third parties are taking these actions seriously or put them on some kind of probation status, right? Or you can pull it into your legal and contractual agreements, and that way, you can sort of put in the legal language they need to stay above a certain cyber threshold, if you will, sort of like the regulatory things we discussed earlier. Or you can just use it for situational awareness or mergers and acquisitions. It all sort of depends on what team you're a part of, how you want to leverage the data, how you want to share the data internally, and what the end goal is. So there's a lot of different ways you can action it.
Okay, good stuff. Here's another one. Let's see, it says, how do I subdivide my third parties? Which third parties do I focus on?
Okay. Sure. So similarly, there are several ways you can subdivide your third parties. Again, with the concept of internet intelligence, essentially what you're saying is you have global information on public-facing internet infrastructures. So what this means ultimately for you as a user is that you can look at any internet infrastructure that you choose to on any various level. So it could be a single domain, it could be an IP, it could be a group of IPs, it could be a network range, it could be an entire autonomous system, an entire organization, your third party, et cetera. So you have a lot of flexibility into how you divide up your third parties and what assets you look at. So for example, if you have a third-party mail provider, you can monitor the single IP that your individual internal users reach out to access that mail server where they get all their business mail from. Or if you have a third party who is a payment processor and they have a distributed network that does payment processing for you, you can monitor those individual networks around the U.S. or around the globe to give you insight and situational awareness of what threats are impacting those specific payment processing networks. Or again, you can monitor your own network or the entire organization if you so choose. So there's several different ways you could group or divide up these third parties. You could group them by the services they provide you. Again, it could be a payment processor or some kind of back office automation. But we typically recommend that you classify your third parties by the role they play to your day-to-day business operations, and or the other slice of that is you could do it by the level of access they have to your critical data system. So if you have a sort of tier one of third parties that have direct or, sufficient access to what you would consider critical data of yours, that might be a tier one group. And then you could have a tier two group which could maybe provide you services, but don't necessarily have access to key or critical data. So you sort of start dividing things up by tiers. We actually have a lot of financial services customers who do exactly this. They monitor. We have one large financial services customer who does this for 1,000 vendors, and we have a lot larger number of smaller financial services companies who do this with a smaller key set of vendors. They've sort of identified 10 or 50 or 100 of their key vendors, third-party suppliers, and they monitor those specific networks that belong to those organizations. So again, it all depends on sort of how you want to leverage that information. But the end goal here is you want to divide up in a way that you can prioritize those third parties and take that tiered approach so that you can continue a successful continuous monitoring program to get the outputs, the data, the information you need to really enforce these rules and make yourself safer.
Those are all great points, Ryan. Here's one more. I think we've got a couple others that came in that probably want a direct reply rather than do the webcast itself. So let's do this last one before we wrap up. It says, you mentioned monitoring, but how am I supposed to monitor my third parties if they won't allow me to put sensors in their network? That's a great one.
Sure. Yep, that's a good point. So when we say monitoring, and I sprinkled this throughout the webinar, but it is important to underline this fact. When we say monitoring at Looking Glass, what we mean is really passive monitoring. So again, you take these data sets that the Looking Glass platforms are generating about the internet and about threats and those types of web presence aspects, and those give you what essentially amounts to publicly available information about your third parties. So you're not reliant on a third party putting a sensor in their network or giving you data logs or giving you anything like that. They're not providing you net flow to do this information. This essentially is passive monitoring by using Looking Glass's technology to understand what the internet looks like and then pulling back salient data points, whether they're threats or vulnerabilities or risks or what have you, about those spaces. So it's not that you have to enforce or ask your third parties to deploy devices in their network to give you this information. This is all passive monitoring technology. So it's totally autonomous of your third parties, and therefore you don't have that dependency on them giving you information. So again, we're trying to move past the check the box approach where you're relying on the third party to give you the information. In this way, because it's passive monitoring, you are not relying on them to give you any of that information. You're able to essentially construct it yourself, and therefore you have more autonomy in your construction or use of that information. So our technology is collecting information from the open source internet as well as structured data feeds to create that internet intelligence or crawl internet-wide content to give you information that is out there about you or your third parties, what have you. Then, of course, we're using a bunch of back-end systems within those platforms to generate the data, correlate the data, aggregate the data about the various risks and threat information that is in those spaces that are important to you because you define who your third parties are.
Fantastic. Okay, at this point, we are almost at our time limit, so let's go ahead and wrap up at this point. So, Ryan, thank you so much for today's presentation. Great stuff. And thanks to everybody that attended today's live webcast from Looking Glass. There will be a recording of our webinar that will be sent out to each of you following the close of our presentation. It'll also be made available on our website under our resources page for additional viewing. So please feel free to share this presentation with your colleagues, or if you came in late, you can back up and make sure that you have the complete session. And also don't forget to sign up for our next webinar. It's going to be held on October 18th, and that one will expand upon issues with third-party risk. It's titled, "Are Your Third-Party Vendors Exposing Your Organization to Cyber Threats?" So obviously third-party risk is a very hot topic, and we've got a lot of great resources, some that are in your resources link. And then this final screen has some great ways that you can reach us. There's our website. You can go there to our social media, or if you wanted to send something to us directly, you can send it to sales@lookingglasscyber.com. But again, thanks to everybody for attending, and we hope to see you back online again for one of our other upcoming ones. And Ryan, thank you so much for your time today. Greatly appreciate it.
Thanks, everyone.